No matter where you are in the world, no matter what you're doing, you live and die by the success of your customers. What I will say is different in Silicon Valley is you have a lot of what I call technology for technology's sake. And so you get a lot of ideas funded that frankly may or may not have any applicability to the real world or a real customer. But at the end of the day, you live and die by value that you create for your customers either way.
This is where it all begins, so say goodbye to all your fears, all your doubts. This is where they die. This is where we come to win, we come to fly. This is where we make our dreams come to life. Welcome to Innovation City.
Welcome to Innovation City, a podcast featuring the innovators, disruptors, and creators who are making things happen. My name is Michael T. Johnson, and I'm here with my co-host Tyler Kelly. And today we are at the EQ Leadership Lab. So we're here in the EQ Leadership Lounge the day before the MDMC conference. So we have a special guest with us today, Mark Young. Mark, thanks for being with us.
Great to be here. Thanks, guys.
So Mark is the CTO and Head of Product for the Climate Corporation. He moved to St. Louis last summer after about 20 years in Silicon Valley. Some cool stuff going on there during your time there. But you come by way of southern New Jersey, where you grew up on a farm.
That's right.
And we were just talking briefly before the show, and it's pretty neat because you kind of have like this technology background, this farming background, and now at the Climate Corporation, you get to kind of merge all those worlds into your position as CTO. And let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's kind of been interesting. So I grew up in southern New Jersey on a farm, small family farm. In fact, my mom and dad still live there. It was small enough where it wasn't enough of an income to support the whole family. So my dad worked full-time, mom worked full-time, and my dad would go in early and come home around 2 o'clock in the afternoon and then farm until dark, basically. So we grew up, we had beef cows when I was little. We had then horses and horse hay business. And my dad always said that, if you worked just hard enough on the farm that we wouldn't be farmers. So, from there, went to Purdue University in Indiana and got a computer science degree, graduated in the late 90s and went straight to Silicon Valley, California after that. So spent about 20 years then in a variety of high-tech companies in California. It was just when the internet was getting started. Mark Andreessen beat me out of Illinois by like 2 years. He's like 2 years older than I am. And so, it was just the beginnings of Netscape and the web and web companies and the internet and all those things. So it was super exciting times. Did a few things, did my own venture-backed startup, as everyone seems to do in Silicon Valley. Did that for about 6 years. Built technology and software all over the world. Was acquired into Zynga, the game company, before their IPO, went through their IPO. Really the advent of the kind of the data-driven or metrics-driven company. They kind of wrote the book on that. Went to Yahoo for a little bit and then got the opportunity to join Climate about 4 years ago as CTO. And what's interesting about Climate is it is that same mashup. It is Silicon Valley technology and expertise applied to an industry which traditionally is not necessarily known for being high tech, and that's agriculture.
So what led you to Climate? Because it sounds like you were kind of made for that position from what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's like most things, when you live and work in Silicon Valley, you realize how small the valley is. Millions of people, but almost everybody knows everybody in some sense. And so one of my former colleagues was actually the chief people officer at Climate at the time and helped them through their acquisition at the time. And they had this role, and they weren't really sure what they needed, whether it was chief architect or CTO or whatnot. But it's this crazy combination of agriculture and tech. And as you can imagine, there's not that many people that fit that bill. But she knew me, and she knew I was a combination of the two. And the rest is history. I joined about 4 years ago now.
So for St. Louis, ag tech is a pretty big deal.
Huge deal. Yeah, you have now you have the world's largest agricultural company headquartered here, formerly Monsanto, now part of Bayer Crop Science. So it's a great place to be, and you're close to a whole lot of farmer customers here in the Midwest.
So tell me about, East Coast, West Coast, and now you're in St. Louis, Missouri. Tell me about that transition.
Yeah, so it's interesting. My job affords me the opportunity to go all over the world, actually. Growing up in the East Coast, especially the Northeast, it's it's interesting, how there's different sort of cultural hubs, even within the United States. I think the Northeast is one that was interesting. And then when I went to school in Indiana, here in the Midwest, of course I got made fun of for my accent straight away. Spent a few years there and pretty much erased that accent, and then went to California. And especially Silicon Valley there is just a melting pot of everyone. I mean, there's every kind of culture there, every kind of ethnicity background, and everybody is just sort of unified in this idea of technology and innovation and things like that. And it's really a pretty amazing environment. And now I'm back to St. Louis and the Midwest again, and it's a nice change of pace from Silicon Valley. If I'm being honest, it's high tech is ruthless. The pace is ruthless, and the success is critical. To keep going. And here in the Midwest, we can slow down a little bit. It's not so cutthroat. It's not such high competition. And agriculture lends itself to that a little bit as well. We have the nice thing about agriculture. It's a pro and a con, is that you work on the agronomic cycle. So you've got a full year to develop products and see how they work before the end of the year, and then your customer makes a decision at the next year. In tech, a lot of times we don't have that, and so it moves as fast as you can, literally as fast as you can iterate and ship product is usually how fast you can move in tech. But in ag, it's not quite like that.
So I'm curious, from both the limitation of being in ag, but also the culture in the Midwest, are there different outcomes because you're just not going as fast as you can? Like, what does that change your output to?
Yeah. It's interesting, and like I said, there's a pro and a con. What's funny is a lot of times one of my biggest frustrations is our pace. We're not able to really match the pace of what I would say a pure technology company can do, and it's because of this sort of link to the real world, if you will. Like, literally, we can't go faster than Mother Nature, right? But then at the same time, it also affords you a little bit of work-life balance, or that myth, that we all know as work-life balance, that you don't necessarily get in tech. I remember, when I did my startup, I was working probably 100 hours a week because there's no throttle to it. You can, as many hours as you can put into it, you can put into it. And so, while sometimes it feels like we're moving slower, it also gives us a little bit of a balance. And I think that's important, especially here in the Midwest too, is to make sure we keep that balance. We don't necessarily want another Silicon Valley. It's a unique place and it's great for what it is, but we don't necessarily want to recreate it here. We want the innovation, but we don't necessarily want that environment. That's why a lot of people are leaving, frankly.
Do you think that environment leads to a difference, like in the end product of whatever you're working on, something that's like more effective or less effective? Because I think, maybe to push that further, if you go super fast, sometimes you put out something that's not quite ready.
Yeah,
but there's positive and negative to that.
Yeah. What I'll say to that is, ultimately, the outcome, no matter where you are in the world, no matter what you're doing, you live and die by the success of your customers, right? So at the end of the day, it's about the value that you can generate for your customers. What I will say is different in Silicon Valley is you have a lot of what I call technology for technology's sake. There's obviously no shortage of ideas, and there's also a lot of money concentrated there. And so you get a lot of ideas funded that, frankly, may or may not have any applicability to the real world or a real customer. And so you end up with these sort of, these technology companies that don't even have a customer identified, right? But they're working on things. Whereas outside of Silicon Valley, I'd say you don't have as much money. And when you don't have as much money, you tend to have much more refined ideas that get funded, right? Just because essentially the competition is higher, while you may not have the number of innovators, you have usually less money. And so the innovation that tends to get funded tends to be much more customer centric. You tend to already have a customer identified, the sort of the pain point that you're trying to address. And so it's just a little bit of a different mindset. But at the end of the day, you live and die by value that you create for your customers either way.
So I think when people that aren't familiar with ag tech, they think of ag tech, they just think of like a bunch of mad scientists doing crazy stuff with food. But I'm sure that it's much more rewarding than that. Tell us about some of the things that you're able to create.
Yeah, it is. So Well, the interesting thing about climate is essentially we're a data science company. We're not necessarily a pure technology or a pure ag company. We're data science applied to agriculture. And, you know, when we started talking about that, and this space didn't exist 3 years ago. We really started with our platform about 3 years ago. And, you know, just like we're talking here today, I had to have the same conversation with farmers who, you know, have been doing essentially the same set of decisions their whole life. And the opportunity that data provides, you know, if you think of what happens in farming and how we make our decisions today, by and large, it's all based on personal experience, right? So I, as a farmer, I farm, I get a certain outcome, I learn something. The next year I apply those learnings and I try to do it a little bit better. And that's true for me if I'm an individual farmer. It's true if I'm using an agronomist who's working across several farms. But at the end of the day, the scope of the information that generally farmers and farming professionals are able to use is quite small. And then you couple to that fact, you know, there's the famous book, 40 Chances, that as a farmer, you know, you really only get about 40 chances in a lifetime to be good at farming. And the economics are such with the commodity prices the way they are that, you know, a couple of bad years and you're not going to be a farmer anymore. And so what we do is we take data and we apply AI techniques to it, you know, machine learning, deep learning, things like that. And it's all about making better decisions. And what we're able to do is by getting a big enough data set, we're looking at data that's, you know, 100 times bigger than, or 1,000 times bigger than what any farmer or farming professional would ever get a chance to look at. And at the end of the day, we're able to derive, you know, insights from that data that just help us all be better. I use the analogy in the medical field of how, you know, when we started training computers to read x-rays and they could achieve, you know, like a 93 or 4% accuracy rate. And, you know, a radiologist human who reads x-rays could be like a 92% accuracy rate or something. I may have those flip-flop, but they're close. But then what we found is if we couple an AI-based approach with a human professional, we reach like a 97% accuracy rate, which is higher than either the computer or the human professional. And that's the same thing that we're doing in ag. We're basically raising the bar. We're bringing newer tools to human professionals with a much bigger data set, much more breadth of information about how products perform on the farm and how to make better decisions. And then we couple that with a human that has all that expertise and the knowledge of how to interpret those recommendations that the computer comes up with, and the combination is really magical. We're just starting to scratch the surface, but the results are really fantastic.
So just for some context, like give us an example of the kind of outcomes that somebody's had.
Yeah, good question. So we have this new tool we've put out. We started testing it last year, and we've got it in market again this year, called our Seed Advisor tool. And what Seed Advisor does is it takes all of the data that goes into the development of different seeds and seed products, and then it takes all of the observational data from across our entire customer footprint. And our customer footprint right now is about 70 million acres of corn and soy data here in the United States. So, you know, that's over 30% of the market, basically, to give you a sense of the breadth and depth of the data set. And what we found is, you know, quite naturally, you can imagine that when we brought this product to market, which will give you basically what we think is a ranked list of the best performing hybrids for your particular field, it was met with skepticism, as you would imagine. Like, farmers are great scientists. They're constantly experimenting on their fields, and they want to believe that they are doing the best thing, and all ag professionals do. And so the first farmer we tested it with put it on about 20% of their acres to try it out. And that year, it netted about a 6 bushel an acre advantage over what they would normally have done. And to give you a sense, like, usually we're making decisions in ag that are 1 or 2 bushels, and so to make a single decision that was 6 bushels, that's a pretty substantial. Yeah, it's a pretty substantial change. And then that same farmer said, you know, given the performance, they went from 20% of their operation to 95+% the following year, taking all the recommendations, and we netted almost 10 bushels an acre the second year. And that's a result of 2 things. One is every year we get more data, the model gets smarter, right? And so we're able to improve the model, and we're able to ingest more data. So every year we get a larger customer footprint, we get more and more data, so we can retrain the same model with more data, which makes the model more accurate, and we can produce newer versions of the model, which make it more accurate. And so that 10 bushel an acre gain is huge, and that's on average across all our fields. We see some fields that have 20, 25 acre bushel gains that factor into that, and so the effect is huge in terms of a single decision that you can make. The choice of seed is one of the biggest decisions you can make as a farmer, and that, again, this is a tool, right? We're not telling you, look, this is what you should plant. We're giving you options that say, you know what, based on all the data, you should be looking at these particular hybrids because we think they would be a good choice. And we still have a human professional on the other side of that has all of the local knowledge about how that field is performing, because there's things that the model doesn't account for yet, right? Whether or not that field has certain disease risk and is susceptible or has a certain history of certain things, the computer may not know all that. And so when we couple that computer recommendation with a human professional, the results are really phenomenal.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Like, is it as simple, not yet, but maybe you're working towards it, to sample the soil in the field, and then based on that analysis, you're able to say, okay, this is the perfect combination of seed, and this is exactly how you should treat it. And then at some point in the future, like, farming could be automated? Is that like a not too far distant future? Or?
It's a good question to ask. I'd say we're on one of the steps along that journey. Whether or not we'll get there will be interesting. I think if you looked at other industries and other places where we've applied AI with enough data set, you do reach that kind of scenario where you can essentially fully automate. The big unknown, of course, in farming is always the weather, and so you can never really account for the weather and things. But I think ultimately you'll be able to control risk much better. You can also get to a much more interesting business model with farming, which is really what you're getting at, which is, farming today is very much a product-driven space where I, as a farmer, I'm constantly looking for the best products to help me get to a particular outcome. And the reason for that is the manufacturers of those products, by and large, don't have any insight into how they're being used on the farm, right? We can prescribe their use. We can talk about where they might work best. We can create, marketing sheets and things like that about how they perform. But actually completing the link from the manufacturer to the product to the actual performance of that product on the farm and getting all that data about how it performs really changes the game. And what it enables for the first time is, instead of me just selling you a product, I can partner with you on the best use of that product, where to put it, how to place it, where it'll perform the best, and I can ultimately then partner with you on the outcome. If you see ag move down this, if it continues to move in this logical model, instead of just selling a customer products, we can now partner with the customer on the service, right? And so instead of selling you a particular seed or a particular chemistry, I can partner with you on yield, or I can partner with you on crop protection. And as part of that service, I can then choose exactly which product or products or combination, and ultimately it's the suite of all those decisions that really get you to the best outcome, right?
If you're measured and your profit is based on their in revenue, then that's a perfect partnership.
Yeah, perfect partnership, and this is this has happened in other manufacturing industries, but it is the perfect partnership because then everyone's interests are aligned, right? We talk about new technologies like See and Spray technology, where instead of just blanket spraying a field, you use image recognition and things like that to just apply a tiny bit of chemistry. You may not even use chemistry ultimately. You may use like physical disruption, or I've even seen startups that are using lasers or electricity to kill weeds and things like that. And so if I'm partnered with you on the overall outcome, I'm just as aligned with those new technologies as you are. And then it becomes a question of, okay, what's the optimal way to achieve that outcome, right? It doesn't matter if I'm trying to do it with a chemical product, or if I'm trying to do it with, a laser or physical disruption or a combination of all three. We're in it together at that point. And that's what's really interesting about what technology is bringing to ag. It's not just technology for technology's sake. It's actually aligning those interests that end up great for the farmer, great for technology companies, and also great for the environment and things like that. Like using less chemistry is great for everyone. It's great for the environment. It's great for the company manufacturing the chemistry, and it's great for the farmer to have the most ideal output.
I think there's something interesting that you said in there. This is just kind of an observation, but every single person that we've talked to here that has been on this podcast at the EQ Leadership Lounge has said the same thing you just said, and it's don't sell somebody more product. Right. It's find out what their problem is, their pain point, and then partner with them for a solution or like a plan. Everyone has said don't sell more things to people. So.
Yeah, I think it is such a powerful, recognition or tenet to run your organization by. And I sit in a very unique seat at Climate where I'm both the CTO and the head of product. And what's interesting about that is, what I've been telling my product team is, look, it's not about the drill bit, it's about the hole. Your customer wants a hole, right? That's really the powerful thing to recognize is as a customer, I'm about the outcome. When I go into the hardware store for a drill bit, it's not ultimately that I really want a drill bit, it's because I need to make a hole. Once you shift your product org and your company's thinking to put yourself in the customer's standpoint, right? Because that's a very customer-centric view. From the customer's perspective, I want a hole. And if you put yourself in that perspective, all of a sudden you think about the world entirely differently, right? And we make a lot of really great drill bits, right? And the trap is, and it was the same at Sun Microsystems. We made really big, awesome computing hardware. We were really proud of it, but then that's not what our customer was interested in. Our customer was in cheap, easy computing, right? And so when Linux came along and x86 hardware came along and services like Red Hat came along, and then ultimately cloud services like Amazon, you can see where making bigger, faster, better drill bits was just a really narrow scope to run the company around. And if you put yourself in your customer's shoes and you focus on the hole, not the drill bit, you open your perspective to those kinds of technologies, and you completely change possibly the course of the company and the decisions that you make and the technologies that you invest in and things like that.
So you mentioned that the Climate Corporation is a subsidiary of Bayer. So what does it, how close is that connection, and what does it feel like to pretty much, do you have unlimited resources, or are you tightly managed? Like, how's that work?
It's a good question. I wish I had unlimited resources. Coming from tech, the analogy I draw to quite often is when Google purchased Android. And part of that is because I had a startup that was very similar to Android at the time. And we faced very similar circumstances in that in the telecom space, the development cycle for a phone is 18 to 24 months. Well, that's a very difficult timeline for a startup because generally your financing is only 6 to 12 months at max, right? And so it's very difficult to play in that space as a startup. Once Google bought Android and the option of the Android technology was backed by Google, it unlocked all kinds of decisions by telecom industry companies because they knew Google wasn't going to go away, right? And so that was the advantage that Android enjoyed, was like, look, we're in it for the long haul. We can make a lot of technology decisions that are going to take 2 and 3, 5 years to develop. And in that sense, we're very similar. So Climate was a Silicon Valley startup. We still have an office in San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, and here in St. Louis as well. And we were acquired. And since I mentioned earlier, ag is a seasonal thing. You have to wait an entire year for your customers to realize the success of your product. We face a lot of the same kinds of headwinds that the Android team did in those early days. And so being backed by Bayer gives us that kind of credence, gives us that kind of backing in the org. We have a phenomenal distribution network with customers, an existing customer base, all those things most startups would kill for, right? And then, of course, the other side of it is you're part of a big enterprise. And so you may not be able to move quite as fast as you could as a startup or make all your own decisions and things like that. So there's a little bit of a trade-off. But at the end of the day, I think the industry wins. And I think if you look at what Android's 85+% of all the shipping volume of smartphones today. I mean, it's a phenomenal success of the world. I was just in Thailand. I spent a lot of time in India. Like, smallholders can pull out a $25 Android handset and access the internet, right? They'll never have a PC, but they will have an Android handset, right? And so the success of that scenario has proven to be quite powerful in the past. And I think this combination of Climate and Bear will do the same thing for agriculture.
That's awesome. Mark, how can people get in touch with you, on the internets and the Climate Corporation?
So you can always visit climate.com. We snagged a great URL early on and access us then. And then you can find me online with @MarkYoung_ag, and you can follow me on Twitter and send me a message and stay up to date in the space.
Yeah, Mark, thanks for being on with us.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
For more episodes, visit innovationcity.co. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. If you're in St. Louis, visit us on a Thursday night. You can find details at vincafstl.org. You can also connect with us on social at We Are Slam or at Venture Cafe STL.
This is where it all begins.